Between March 18th and March 20th, 2011, approximately 300 people disappeared in the town of Allende, Coahuila, Mexico. Men, women, children, entire families vanished in 72 hours of coordinated violence that targeted specific homes, specific ranches, specific people connected by business relationships and blood ties to a single informant. The method: systematic kidnapping, torture, execution, and incineration of bodies in makeshift crematoria. The perpetrators, members of the Los Zetas cartel, operating with the active participation of local police and municipal authorities. The Mexican government would try to classify it as isolated criminal activity, as cartel violence that was regrettable but not state-sponsored. But the evidence told a different story. It told of federal agents leaking information that got hundreds killed. It told of municipal police delivering victims directly to executioners. It told of a town that watched its neighbors dragged from their homes and burned alive while authorities did nothing because authorities were part of the operation. And it told of a massacre so complete that bodies were never found, families were never notified, and the Mexican government denied anything significant had happened until investigative journalists forced the truth into public view 3 years later. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events that exposed how deeply Mexican cartels had penetrated government institutions and how easily entire communities could be erased when criminal organizations operated with state protection and official indifference. Coahuila is Mexico's third-largest state, covering roughly 152,000 square kilometers in the northeastern part of the country, bordered by Texas to the north. In 2011, the state was home to approximately 2.7 million people, with an economy based on mining, manufacturing, and agriculture. The geography was harsh: desert and semi-arid plains, mountains in the west, temperatures that could hit 40 degrees Celsius in summer and drop below freezing in winter. A place where distances were vast, where small towns were isolated, where government presence was minimal except when government meant corruption. The town of Allende sat about 50 kilometers from the Texas border, population approximately 23,000, situated in the wine-producing region of northern Coahuila. Allende wasn't a slum or a desperately poor community. It was middle class by Mexican standards. People owned small businesses, worked in nearby factories, farmed land that had been in families for generations. The town had paved streets, decent schools, a central plaza where families gathered on weekends. It looked safe. It looked normal. It looked like the kind of place where massacres didn't happen. But by 2011, Coahuila had become a war zone in Mexico's drug conflict, a strategic corridor for trafficking drugs and weapons between the interior of Mexico and the United States. Control of Coahuila meant control of billions in drug revenue. And in 2011, Coahuila was controlled almost completely by Los Zetas, one of the most violent criminal organizations in Mexican history. Los Zetas had started as the enforcement arm of the Gulf Cartel, formed in the late 1990s by deserters from Mexican special forces who brought military training, tactics, and weaponry to cartel operations. By 2010, the Zetas had broken away from the Gulf Cartel and become independent, controlling drug trafficking, kidnapping, extortion, and human smuggling across northeastern Mexico. They were distinguished from other cartels by their military structure, their systematic use of terror, and their complete penetration of government institutions at municipal, state, and sometimes federal levels. In Coahuila specifically, Los Zetas had essentially replaced the government in many rural areas. They collected taxes from businesses. They controlled who could operate, who could travel, who lived, and who died. Municipal police in many towns worked directly for the Zetas, receiving better pay from the cartel than from government. Mayors negotiated with cartel leadership before making any significant decisions. The state government, led by Governor Humberto Moreira Valdez, and then his brother Ruben Moreira, was either complicit or powerless, probably both. March 2011 was the beginning of spring in Coahuila. The weather was mild, temperatures around 20-25 degrees Celsius during the day, cool at night. The desert was briefly green from winter rains, before the brutal heat of summer would turn everything brown again. In Allende, life moved at its normal pace. People worked, attended school, visited family, lived their lives with the kind of routine that suggested permanence, that suggested tomorrow would look like today. But beneath that normalcy was fear. Everyone in Allende knew about Los Zetas, knew that certain businesses were cartel-owned, knew that certain people in town worked for the organization, knew that asking questions or showing too much curiosity was dangerous. The unwritten rule was simple: see nothing, hear nothing, say nothing, and maybe you'll be left alone. What nobody in Allende knew was that someone had broken the rule. Someone had talked, and Los Zetas were about to demonstrate what happened when silence was broken. His name was José Vázquez Reyes, though most people in Allende knew him as El Huache, or simply as Pepe. He was 40 years old in March 2011, born in Allende, had lived there his entire life, except for a few years working construction in Texas. Pepe came from a large family, 6 siblings, dozens of cousins, nieces, nephews, all interconnected through the kind of extended family networks common in Mexican small towns where everyone was related to everyone else by blood or marriage. Pepe stood about 5'8", stocky, with the build of someone who'd done physical labor his entire life. He had a round face, thinning hair he kept short, and the weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors. His most distinctive feature was his smile, easy, frequent, the kind of smile that made people trust him, that made him seem harmless, ordinary, forgettable. What Pepe valued most was family. He had a wife, Laura, and 4 children ranging from ages 8 to 17. He worked multiple jobs to support them, operating a small trucking business, hauling agricultural products, doing construction work when trucking was slow, running errands for people who paid cash for services that didn't require receipts or documentation. He wasn't wealthy, but wasn't poor either. Comfortable by Allende standards, which meant he could feed his family, pay rent, maybe save a little for his children's education. But Pepe had a problem that he'd managed to hide from almost everyone. He was in debt to Los Zetas. The debt had started small, maybe $5,000 borrowed to buy a truck, when his old one broke down. But the interest was brutal, 20% monthly, compounding. Within a year, the $5,000 had grown to $15,000. Pepe made payments when he could, but could never pay enough to reduce the principal. The debt just grew, month after month, until it became clear he'd never pay it off through legitimate work. So Pepe made a decision that would kill hundreds of people, including most of his own family. He became a police informant. In late 2010, Pepe had been approached by agents from the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA. They'd been watching him, knew about his debt, knew he'd done some work for Los Zetas, nothing major, just transportation, moving packages from one location to another, the kind of minor involvement that was common in towns where the cartel controlled everything. The DEA agents offered Pepe a deal: work as an informant, provide information about Los Zetas operations in Coahuila, and in exchange they'd help with his debt, possibly help him relocate to the United States, give him witness protection. Pepe accepted, not because he was brave or principled, but because he was desperate. The debt was crushing him. Los Zetas had started threatening his family, suggesting that if he couldn't pay with money, he could pay with his children. The DEA seemed like a way out. For 4 months, from November 2010 through February 2011, Pepe provided information to his DEA handlers. He identified Los Zetas safe houses in Allende and surrounding towns. He provided information about drug shipment routes, about which municipal police were on the cartel payroll, about money laundering operations running through local businesses. Most importantly, he provided information about specific people, names, addresses, family connections, business relationships. The DEA was building a case, planning a major operation targeting Los Zetas leadership in northeastern Mexico. Pepe's information was valuable, detailed, the kind of ground-level intelligence that only comes from someone embedded in the community. The DEA promised Pepe protection, promised extraction before any operation began, promised his cooperation would remain secret. They were lying, or more accurately, they were incompetent. On March 18, 2011, the DEA and Mexican federal authorities conducted a series of raids across multiple states, arresting dozens of people connected to Los Zetas operations. The raids were supposed to be coordinated, simultaneous, so fast that Los Zetas wouldn't have time to respond. But the coordination failed. Information leaked. And Los Zetas learned not only about the raids, but about their source, Jose Vasquez Reyes, from Allende, Coahuila. The leak came from Mexican federal police, who'd been briefed on the operation. Some of these federal officers were on Los Zetas' payroll, had been for years, supplementing their government salaries with cartel money. They warned their real employers about the raids and provided the name of the informant who'd made the raids possible. By the afternoon of March 18th, Los Zetas leadership knew Pepe had betrayed them. They knew where he lived. They knew his entire family. And they made a decision that reflected the cartel's operational philosophy. Don't just kill the informant. Kill everyone connected to him. Destroy his entire network, family, friends, business associates, anyone who might have known about his cooperation, and do it in a way that sends a message so terrifying that nobody would ever consider informing again. The order went out from Los Zetas leadership to their operatives in Allende. Find everyone connected to Jose Vasquez Reyes and eliminate them. Not just him, everyone. Use the municipal police to identify targets, to provide transportation, to ensure no interference. Use local Zetas operatives who knew the town, knew the people, could identify family connections. And do it fast, completely, before anyone could escape or the federal government could intervene. The massacre began at 10:30 p.m. on March 18, 2011. Pepe wasn't in Allende when the killing started. His DEA handlers had extracted him 3 days earlier, taken him to a safe house in Texas, promised his family would be brought across the border once the raids were complete. But the raids happened too fast. The extraction never occurred, and Pepe's family was still in Allende when Los Zetas came looking for them. The first target was Pepe's brother, Luis Vasquez Reyes, 38 years old, who lived on Calle Hidalgo with his wife and 3 children. At 10:30 p.m., 3 trucks pulled up to Luis's house, 2 Ford F-150s and a Chevrolet Silverado, all late model, all with tinted windows. 8 men climbed out, some wearing municipal police uniforms, others in civilian clothes, but carrying military-grade weapons. AR-15s, AK-47s, the kind of firepower that made resistance impossible. They didn't knock. They kicked in the front door, stormed through the house, found Luis in the kitchen with his wife Maria and their children. The children were ages 11, 9, and 6. The Zetas operatives grabbed Luis, zip-tied his hands behind his back, dragged him outside. Maria screamed, begged them not to take her husband, tried to stop them. One of the men hit her across the face with his rifle butt, knocking her unconscious. The children stood frozen, too terrified to move. The men threw Luis into the bed of one of the trucks. Then they went back inside, grabbed Maria, still unconscious, and threw her in the truck as well. They took the 3 children, forced them into the cab of another truck. The entire operation took maybe 4 minutes. Then the convoy drove away, heading south toward the outskirts of town, toward properties that Los Zetas controlled, toward places where screaming couldn't be heard. Luis's neighbors watched through windows, behind curtains, saw everything but did nothing because doing something meant becoming a target. In Allende, you didn't interfere with Los Zetas operations. You didn't call police because police were Los Zetas. You didn't help because helping meant dying alongside the people you tried to save. At 11:15 p.m., the same pattern repeated at another house. This time the target was Pepe's cousin, Rodolfo Vasquez, 42, who operated a small auto repair shop. The Zetas took Rodolfo, his wife, his 17-year-old son, and his 14-year-old daughter. Same method: forced entry, zip ties, thrown into trucks, driven away. The entire family disappeared in minutes. At midnight, they hit Pepe's sister's house, took her, her husband, their 2 teenage sons. At 12:45 a.m., they took another cousin and his family. At 1:30 a.m., they took a business associate who'd worked with Pepe's trucking company. Each target carefully selected from information the Zetas had compiled about Pepe's network. Every family member, every business connection, every person who might have known about his cooperation with the DEA. By dawn on March 19th, approximately 30 people had been kidnapped from Allende. Entire families pulled from their homes in the middle of the night. Neighbors watched in terror, understanding that Los Zetas were operating systematically, that this wasn't random violence, but a coordinated operation targeting everyone connected to the informant. But the killing wasn't happening in town. Los Zetas had learned from previous mistakes. Public executions generated media attention, brought federal scrutiny, created problems. Better to make people disappear, take them to remote locations, kill them away from witnesses, destroy the bodies so completely that proving murder became impossible, make entire families vanish as if they'd never existed. The primary killing ground was a ranch about 15 kilometers south of Allende called Rancho La Carreta. The property belonged to a Zetas operative named José Luis El Coyote Garza Gaitan, who'd purchased it in 2009 using money from drug trafficking and extortion. The ranch covered about 50 hectares, isolated, surrounded by desert, accessible only by dirt roads that municipal police now blocked to prevent any accidental witnesses. At the ranch, Los Zetas had prepared for mass execution. They'd built large pits, maybe 5 meters long by 3 meters wide by 2 meters deep. They'd stockpiled wood, tires, diesel fuel, everything needed to cremate bodies. They'd brought in 50-gallon drums that could be used as improvised furnaces. They'd created an assembly line for murder. Victims would be brought to the ranch, interrogated about what they knew about Pepe's cooperation, tortured for information about other potential informants, executed, and then burned until nothing remained but ash and bone fragments that would be scattered or buried in the desert. The interrogations were brutal. Los Zetas wanted to know who else had known about Pepe's cooperation, who else might have talked to authorities, whether the DEA had other informants in Coahuila. They used methods learned from their military training: beatings, electrocution, waterboarding, mutilation. Some victims were killed quickly when it became clear they knew nothing. Others were tortured for hours, kept alive through multiple sessions, their screams echoing across empty desert where nobody could hear them or help them. Luis Vasquez Reyes, Pepe's brother who'd been taken first, was interrogated for approximately 6 hours, according to later testimonies from Zetas operatives who were eventually arrested. Luis knew nothing. Pepe had never told him about cooperating with the DEA, had protected his family by keeping them ignorant. But Los Zetas didn't believe him. They tortured him, demanding information he didn't have, punishing him for his brother's betrayal. Around 5 a.m. on March 19th, Luis was executed with a single bullet to the head. His body was placed in one of the pits, doused with diesel fuel and set on fire. His wife Maria regained consciousness during her own interrogation. She was tortured, raped by multiple Zetas operatives, kept alive longer than her husband because the cartel's culture normalized sexual violence against women as an additional form of terror and punishment. She was eventually executed around noon on March 19th, approximately 14 hours after being kidnapped from her home. Her body was burned in the same pit as her husband. Their 3 children, ages 11, 9, and 6, were killed on the morning of March 19th. There's no confirmed information about how they died, whether they were forced to watch their parents torture, whether they understood what was happening. The only certainty is that their bodies were found years later, mixed with their parents' remains in mass graves that would eventually be excavated. 3 children murdered because their uncle had informed on a drug cartel. This pattern repeated throughout the day on March 19th. Families brought to the ranch, interrogated, tortured, executed, burned. The operation was systematic, methodical, industrial in its efficiency. Loss. Zetas operatives worked in shifts, some conducting interrogations and executions, others managing the fires, others bringing new victims from Allende, others blocking roads to prevent interference. Municipal police participated directly. Officers helped identify targets, provided lists of Pepe's family and associates, drove victims to the ranch, and in some cases participated in interrogations and executions. The police chief of Allende, Luis Fernando Delgado, coordinated with Los Zetas, ensuring that no police would respond to calls about kidnappings, that no investigations would be opened, that the massacre could proceed without government interference. By the afternoon of March 19th, Los Zetas had expanded their target list. They were no longer just going after Pepe's immediate family and close associates. They were targeting anyone who'd done business with him, anyone who'd been seen talking to him recently, anyone who might potentially have known about his DEA cooperation. This included the Garza family, one of Allende's oldest and most respected families. Alejo Garza Tamez, 56, owned a ranch north of town where he raised horses and cattle. Alejo wasn't related to Pepe by blood, but he'd sold horses to Pepe's trucking company, had been seen meeting with Pepe several times in recent months. That was enough to make him a target. Around 3 p.m. on March 19th, a convoy of trucks approached Alejo's ranch. Unlike most victims, Alejo saw them coming. He was a former federal police officer, had weapons, knew how to use them. When the convoy stopped at his gate and armed men climbed out, Alejo told his family to run, then opened fire with a hunting rifle. The gunfight lasted approximately 30 minutes. Alejo was outnumbered, outgunned, fighting from his house, while 20 or more Zetas operatives surrounded the property. He killed 4 of them, wounded several others, held them off long enough for his wife and children to escape through the back of the property and flee to a neighboring ranch. But eventually, the Zetas rushed the house, overwhelmed him, and executed him. Alejo's stand was unusual. Most victims didn't resist because resistance was futile against overwhelming force. But his death demonstrated something important. Los Zetas weren't just eliminating people quietly. They were willing to engage in open combat, to accept casualties, to use extreme violence in pursuit of targets. This suggested the operation had high-level authorization, that cartel leadership viewed this massacre as critical to sending a message about informants. After killing Alejo, the Zetas burned his ranch house to the ground, destroyed everything, then took his body to Rancho La Carreta, where it was burned with the others. They also took Alejo's elderly mother, who'd been at the ranch during the gunfight, and executed her at the ranch as well. She was 77 years old, had nothing to do with Pepe or the DEA, but was killed anyway because she was connected to someone who'd resisted. Throughout March 19th and into March 20th, the kidnappings continued. Los Zetas operatives moved through Allende systematically, working from lists, checking off names, ensuring complete elimination of anyone connected to the informant. They took entire families from homes, from businesses, from the street. A man who'd rented a warehouse to Pepe's trucking company, taken with his wife and 2 sons. A woman who'd done bookkeeping for Pepe, taken with her elderly parents. A teenager who'd worked as a driver for Pepe, taken with his girlfriend who happened to be visiting him when the Zetas arrived. The town was paralyzed with terror. People locked themselves in their homes, turned off lights, pretended not to be home when trucks passed by. Schools closed. Businesses shut down. The Central Plaza, normally crowded on weekends, was empty. Everyone understood something catastrophic was happening, but nobody knew the scale because nobody was counting, nobody was reporting, and the government was doing nothing to stop it. By the evening of March 20th, the main phase of the massacre was ending. Los Zetas had processed approximately 300 people through Rancho La Carreta and other killing grounds in the area. The exact number would never be known with certainty because bodies had been destroyed so completely. But witnesses, survivors, and later investigations would estimate between 250 and 300 victims, making this one of the largest mass killings in Mexican history, comparable to or exceeding massacres committed during Mexico's dirty wars of the 1970s and 80s. The disposal of remains was systematic. Bodies had been burned in pits until reduced to ash and bone fragments. These remains were then either scattered across the ranch property, dumped in nearby ravines, or buried in shallow graves that would be discovered years later. Some bodies were dissolved using acid or caustic chemicals, a method Los Zetas had learned from other cartels. The goal was to make identification impossible, to ensure that families could never confirm their loved ones had died, to create a situation where legally the victims hadn't been murdered because there was no proof they were dead. What's extraordinary about the Allende massacre is what happened after. Nothing. Despite hundreds of people disappearing over a 72-hour period, despite families reporting missing loved ones, despite entire neighborhoods being depopulated, the Mexican government did nothing. No investigation was opened. No federal authorities arrived. No military deployment to secure the town. Nothing. The state government of Coahuila, led by Governor Ruben Moreira, denied anything significant had happened. When journalists started asking questions, the official line was that a few people had been reported missing, but this was probably just migration, people leaving for economic reasons, heading to the United States or to other parts of Mexico looking for work. Nothing unusual for the region. The mayor of Allende, Sergio Lozano, who'd been in office since 2009, said nothing publicly. Behind closed doors, he was terrified, knew that Los Zetas had carried out the massacre with the participation of his municipal police, knew that speaking out would make him the next target. He stayed silent, continued governing as if nothing had happened, signed off on death certificates when families requested them, but listed causes of death as unknown or missing rather than murder. The municipal police, who'd actively participated in the massacre, continued operating normally. Officers patrolled streets, responded to calls, maintained the appearance of law enforcement, while everyone in town knew they'd help deliver neighbors to executioners. Some officers showed signs of trauma, drinking heavily, missing work, requesting transfers out of Allende, but most continued their routines because they had no choice. They'd crossed a line, were now complicit in mass murder, and could only survive by pretending it hadn't happened. The Catholic Church in Allende, normally a voice for communities in crisis, stayed silent. The parish priest, Father Antonio, had been approached by families looking for help finding missing loved ones. He'd wanted to speak out, to demand government action, to use his position to force accountability. But he received visits from people he recognized as Los Zetas operatives, conversations where they didn't explicitly threaten him, but made clear that the church's influence in Allende depended on the church staying quiet about certain matters. Father Antonio stayed quiet. Years later, in an anonymous interview, he said, "I failed them. I failed the families. I failed God. But I was afraid. Everyone was afraid, and fear makes cowards of us all." Families who'd lost loved ones were trapped in impossible situations. They couldn't go to municipal police because police had participated in the kidnappings. They couldn't go to state authorities because state authorities denied anything had happened. They couldn't go to federal authorities because contacting federal authorities meant explaining why their family members had been targeted, which meant acknowledging the family's connection to an informant, which would make them additional targets. Some families fled Allende entirely, abandoning homes and businesses, moving to other states or crossing into Texas as refugees. Others stayed but stopped talking about their missing family members, stopped searching, stopped hoping, because hope was dangerous when the perpetrators controlled the town. One woman, Maria Celia Rocha, lost her husband and 2 adult sons during the massacre. They'd done business with Pepe, had been associates in his trucking company. For weeks after they disappeared, Maria Celia searched. She went to the municipal police station every day, filed reports, demanded information. The police told her nothing. She contacted state authorities, who told her to file reports with municipal police. She contacted human rights organizations, who took her information but could do nothing without government cooperation. On April 15, 2011, Maria Celia received a visit at her home. 2 men in civilian clothes who introduced themselves as investigators from the state attorney general's office. They sat in her living room, drank the coffee she served, and then very politely explained that her husband and sons had probably left looking for work, that this happened frequently in Coahuila, that she should stop filing reports because persistent reports created problems for everyone. "What kind of problems?" Maria Celia asked. One of the men smiled. "The kind where you end up looking for 4 family members instead of 3. Maria Celia stopped filing reports, but she didn't stop remembering. Years later, when journalists finally investigated the massacre, Maria Celia would be one of the few witnesses willing to speak on record, to say the names of her lost family members, to describe what had happened and what the government had failed to do. Jose Vasquez Reyes, Pepe, lived in his DEA safe house in Texas while his family and friends were being massacred in Allende. He didn't know what was happening initially. The DEA had moved him and told him to wait while they processed paperwork for witness protection, while they coordinated extraction of his family. On March 21st, 3 days after the massacre began, Pepe's DEA handler finally told him what had happened. Information had leaked, Los Zetas had learned about his cooperation, and there'd been an incident in Allende involving his family. The handler didn't provide details. didn't confirm how many people had been killed, just said the situation was complicated and that extracting his family was no longer possible. Pepe demanded to know if his wife and children were safe. The handler said they didn't have confirmation either way, that communication with local authorities in Coahuila was difficult, that they were still gathering information. This was a lie. The DEA knew by March 20th that a mass killing had occurred, knew that Pepe's family was among the victims, but didn't want to tell him because they feared he'd do something stupid, like try to return to Mexico or contact authorities directly, which would compromise the DEA's operations. Pepe eventually learned the truth from other sources. Family members who'd survived and fled to Texas, news reports that started trickling out despite government denials. His wife Laura was dead. His 4 children, ages 8 to 17, were dead. His siblings, his cousins, his business associates, all dead or disappeared. Dozens of people, maybe over 100, all killed because he'd cooperated with the DEA. The guilt destroyed him. Pepe spent 6 months in the safe house in Texas, protected by federal agents, waiting for witness protection placement. He was depressed, barely eating, barely sleeping, tormented by the knowledge that his cooperation had resulted in the massacre of his entire extended family. The DEA provided psychological counseling, medication, supervision to prevent suicide attempts. In September 2011, Pepe was given a new identity and relocated to a city in the southwestern United States, location never disclosed. He received a stipend from the federal government, enough to live modestly. He was supposed to start a new life, forget his past, accept that his cooperation had been necessary for the greater good of dismantling Los Zetas operations. He lasted 3 months. On December 8, 2011, Jose Vasquez Reyes, using his new identity, walked into his bathroom, took every pill in the medicine cabinet the DEA had provided for his depression and anxiety, and died of an overdose. He left no note. His DEA handler found him the next day during a routine check-in visit. The DEA classified his death as a suicide resulting from depression and trauma, not related to the agency's handling of his case or the leak that had resulted in the Allende massacre. His death was not reported to media. His new identity was expunged from records. Officially, Jose Vasquez Reyes had disappeared in March 2011, along with hundreds of other residents of Allende, Coahuila. The fact that he'd survived to December before killing himself remained classified information. For 3 years after the massacre, the Mexican government maintained that nothing significant had happened in Allende. Official records show that in March 2011, approximately 26 people were reported missing from Allende and surrounding communities. Just 26 in a massacre that killed at least 250 and probably closer to 300. The discrepancy existed because most families never filed missing person reports. They didn't file reports because they knew reporting was dangerous, because police had participated in the massacre, because the government would do nothing. So officially, according to Mexican government statistics, the Allende incident was a minor event, a handful of disappearances probably related to migration or criminal activity, but not rising to the level of massacre or requiring federal intervention. Governor Rubén Moreira of Coahuila maintained this narrative throughout his term. When questioned by journalists about reports of mass graves and mass disappearances in northern Coahuila, he dismissed them as exaggerations, as anti-government propaganda, as attempts to damage Coahuila's image and hurt economic development. He pointed out that no bodies had been found, that no credible evidence existed of any massacre, that rumors weren't facts. The federal government under President Felipe Calderón and later under President Enrique Peña Nieto supported Coahuila's position. Acknowledging the Allende massacre would mean acknowledging that Los Zetas had carried out one of the largest mass killings in Mexican history with the participation of municipal police, and that state and federal governments had done nothing to stop it or to investigate it afterward. It would mean acknowledging that Mexico's drug war strategy had failed catastrophically, that government institutions were so penetrated by cartels that entire towns could be massacred without consequences. Better to deny. Better to classify Allende as an unfortunate incident involving a modest number of disappearances in a region where violence was common and disappearances were regrettably frequent. Better to move on, to focus attention elsewhere, to wait for the story to fade from public consciousness, but some people refuse to let it fade. In 2014, 3 years after the massacre, investigative journalists from Mexican outlets Proceso and Zeta began investigating rumors about mass graves in northern Coahuila. They interviewed families who'd lost loved ones, survivors who'd fled to Texas, former police officers who'd left Allende after the massacre, and eventually some low-level Los Zetas operatives who'd been arrested for other crimes and who were willing to provide information in exchange for reduced sentences. The journalists pieced together what had happened: the DEA informant, the leak, the systematic targeting of anyone connected to him, the participation of municipal police, the killing grounds at various ranches, the cremation of bodies, the government's deliberate denial and inaction. In June 2014, Proceso published a detailed investigative report titled The Allende Massacre: How the DEA Got Hundreds Killed in Mexico. The article documented the massacre, named names, described the mechanics of how information had leaked from Mexican federal police to Los Zetas, and detailed the government's cover-up. The report was explosive, generated national and international attention, forced the Mexican government to respond. The response was predictable: denials, attacks on the journalists' credibility, claims that the report was based on unreliable sources and unverified information. But the evidence was compelling enough that international human rights organizations demanded action. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights opened an investigation. The United States Congress held hearings about DEA operations in Mexico and the Allende leak. Under pressure, the Mexican government finally acknowledged that a serious incident had occurred in Allende in March 2011, but continued to downplay the scale. Official acknowledgement listed 42 confirmed deaths, far below the actual number, based on the rationale that only 42 bodies had been recovered and identified. The hundreds of victims who'd been burned or dissolved, or whose remains were destroyed beyond identification, didn't count as confirmed deaths. In 2016, 5 years after the massacre, Mexican authorities finally began excavating mass graves in the area around Allende. They found human remains at multiple locations, Rancho La Carreta and other properties used by Los Zetas as killing grounds. The remains were fragmentary, burned, mixed, together making individual identification almost impossible. Forensic teams estimated the remains represented at least 150 individuals, possibly more, but couldn't determine exact numbers or provide definitive identifications. DNA testing was conducted on some remains, matched against family members who'd filed missing person reports. By 2018, approximately 30 victims had been positively identified through DNA. The other remains, representing hundreds of people, remained in storage, unidentified, unclaimed, reduced to numbered evidence bags in a government warehouse. The prosecutions related to the Allende massacre were shamefully limited. Between 2014 and 2020, Mexican authorities arrested and charged approximately 15 people, 6 municipal police officers from Allende, including former police chief Luis Fernando Delgado, charged with kidnapping, murder, and organized crime. 5 were convicted and received sentences ranging from 25 to 40 years. 1 was acquitted due to insufficient evidence. 9 Los Zetas operatives, all low-level members who'd participated in kidnappings, interrogations, or executions. 8 were convicted with sentences from 30 to 50 years. 1 was killed in prison before his trial, but the prosecutions were incomplete. The Los Zetas leadership who'd ordered the massacre were never charged. Most were already imprisoned on other charges or had been killed in cartel conflicts. The federal police officers who'd leaked information to Los Zetas were never identified or prosecuted. State government officials who'd participated in the cover-up were never investigated. The DEA agents whose incompetence or negligence had allowed the leak faced no consequences. The agency conducted an internal review, classified the findings, and continued operations. Most significantly, no government officials at state or federal level faced accountability for the cover-up, for denying the massacre had occurred, for refusing to investigate or protect residents, for allowing Los Zetas to operate with impunity in Coahuila. Former Governor Humberto Moreira, who'd governed Coahuila from 2005 to 2011 and whose policies had allowed Los Zetas to penetrate government institutions completely, was arrested in Spain in 2016 on money laundering charges unrelated to Allende. He was extradited to Mexico, tried and acquitted in 2017. He currently lives freely in Mexico, has never been charged with any crimes related to the Allende massacre, and has denied any knowledge of Los Zetas' activities in Coahuila during his governorship. His brother, Ruben Moreira, who governed Coahuila from 2011 to 2017 and who'd overseen the government's denial and cover-up of the massacre, was never investigated. He completed his term as governor, was elected to the Mexican Congress in 2018, and continues in politics. In interviews, he maintains that the Allende incident was regrettable, but that his government had responded appropriately given the information available at the time. Allende never recovered. The town's population dropped from approximately $23,000 in early 2011 to around 19,000 by 2015. Thousands fled after the massacre, abandoning homes that stood empty for years, businesses that closed permanently. The town's economy collapsed, tourism vanished, investment dried up, young people left as soon as they could. By 2020, Allende was a ghost town. Entire neighborhoods stood empty, houses abandoned, streets overgrown. The Central Plaza, once the heart of community life, was mostly deserted. Businesses operated at minimal capacity, serving a diminished population that lived with constant fear. Los Zetas were eventually displaced by other cartels as control of Coahuila shifted, but the violence continued, just with different perpetrators. The psychological trauma was pervasive. Everyone in Allende knew someone who'd disappeared during the massacre. Everyone lived with the knowledge that their government had allowed it to happen, had denied it occurred, had done nothing to provide justice or protect survivors. Trust in authority was completely destroyed. People didn't cooperate with police, didn't report crimes, handled problems privately because involving government meant inviting disaster. A memorial was finally erected in 2019, 8 years after the massacre. It's located in Allende's Central Plaza, a simple monument with a plaque that reads, "In memory of the disappeared of Allende, March 2011. May we never forget." The memorial doesn't list names because there's no definitive list. The government still doesn't acknowledge most of the victims. It doesn't specify what happened because the government still minimizes the scale of the massacre. On March 18th each year, a small group gathers at the memorial, maybe 30 or 40 people, mostly families of victims, a few activists and journalists. They hold a brief ceremony, Read some names of the disappeared. Observe silence. The gatherings are small, poorly attended, largely ignored by media and government. Most people in Allende don't attend, because attending means being identified as someone who cares about the massacre, which could still be dangerous. Maria Cilia Rocha, who lost her husband and 2 sons, attends every year. She's now in her 70s, gray-haired, bent from decades of grief. In 2021, on the 10th anniversary, she spoke to a journalist. "My husband was a good man. My sons were good men. They worked hard. They loved their families. They never hurt anyone. They're dead because they knew someone who talked to the DEA. That's all. They were murdered and burned, and the government pretends it didn't happen. I come here every year to say their names because someone has to remember. Someone has to say that this happened, that 300 people died here, that our government allowed it. I'll keep coming until I die, and I hope someone younger keeps coming after I'm gone, because the only justice we'll ever get is memory." The U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration faced intense criticism after the Allende massacre became public knowledge. Congressional hearings in 2014 and 2015 examined what had gone wrong, how information about an informant had leaked, why extraction of the informant's family hadn't been prioritized, whether proper protocols had been followed. The DEA's responses were bureaucratic and evasive. They acknowledged that information security protocols had been inadequate, but insisted that the leak had come from Mexican federal authorities, not from DEA personnel. They acknowledged that extraction of the informant's family had been delayed due to operational complexities, but maintained that the speed of the Los Zetas response had been unprecedented and unpredictable. They expressed regret for the loss of life, but denied that DEA incompetence or negligence had caused the massacre. Internal DEA reviews remained classified. The agents involved in managing Jose Vasquez Reyes as an informant faced no public disciplinary action. Whether they faced internal consequences is unknown. The DEA's informant protocols were allegedly revised after Allende, but the specifics remain classified for national security reasons. What is clear is that the DEA continues operating in Mexico, continues recruiting informants, continues conducting joint operations with Mexican authorities, despite documented evidence that Mexican authorities routinely leak information to cartels. The institutional response to Allende was essentially, "This was unfortunate. We've learned lessons. We've improved procedures. Now let's move forward." For the families of 300 victims, moving forward meant their loved ones died for an American law enforcement operation that was compromised from the beginning, that sacrificed Mexican lives in pursuit of American drug policy objectives, and that resulted in no accountability for the U.S. government agents whose actions set the massacre in motion. The Allende massacre forces impossible questions about drug war strategies, about the ethics of using informants in contexts where government institutions are penetrated by criminal organizations, about what happens when law enforcement operations in one country get people killed in another country without consequences. Jose Vasquez Reyes made a choice to become an informant, motivated by debt and fear and DEA promises of protection. His choice got hundreds of people killed. But Pepe didn't create the conditions that made his choice destructive. Those conditions existed because Los Zetas had completely penetrated Coahuila's government institutions, because Mexican authorities routinely worked for cartels, because the DEA operated in Mexico without adequate security for informants or their families, and because both governments prioritized drug interdiction over human life. The Mexican government's response, denial, minimization, cover-up, minimal prosecutions, demonstrated that Los Zetas weren't the only ones who viewed rural Mexicans as expendable. The government's failure to investigate, to protect, to provide justice, to even acknowledge the full scale of what happened sent a clear message. Some Mexican lives don't matter enough to disrupt political and economic agendas. The United States government's response, bureaucratic deflection, classified reviews, no accountability for DEA personnel, demonstrated that American drug policy treats Mexican deaths as acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of objectives that have failed for decades to reduce drug availability or consumption in the United States. And the residents of Allende, caught between a cartel that massacred them and governments that abandoned them, learned what marginalized communities worldwide have learned repeatedly: justice is for people with power. Everyone else just survives the best they can and tries to remember their dead, even when authorities prefer they forget. If this story made you think about the human cost of drug wars, about government complicity in cartel violence, and about how easily entire communities can be erased when their lives are considered expendable, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that expose the systems of violence and impunity that governments prefer to keep hidden. Comment below: where is accountability when both law enforcement and criminals are complicit in massacres? How should families pursue justice when their governments deny atrocities occurred? Until next time, remember, the monsters we fear aren't always the cartels. Sometimes they're the government officials who work with cartels, the federal agents whose incompetence gets civilians killed, the politicians who deny massacres happened, and the institutions that prioritize bureaucratic convenience over human life. The Allende massacre happened because hundreds of people were considered acceptable losses in someone else's war. And it keeps happening because nobody with power faced consequences for allowing it.